whoever did this has to be soulless. I mean, can't even be a human being.
Kelsey Turner was living the dream, or so it seemed. As a former Playboy Italia model with a lavish social media presence, she appeared to have it all, including beauty, fame, and luxury. But behind the glamorous facade was a life spiraling out of control, one that was fueled by financial struggles, toxic relationships, and dangerous manipulations. It turns out that her extravagant lifestyle was actually being paid for by a Dr. Thomas Burchard, a well-respected child psychologist who had been financially supporting her for several years. But when he decided to cut her off, well, let's just say that she was not all too happy about it. And so, when he suddenly vanished in March of 2019, his actual partner had a very strong suspicion. So, what happened to Thomas? Was Kelsey to blame? Why was she known as the Bad Barbie? And how would this horrible story unfold? Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at a case that involves extreme entitlement, blackmail, and somehow Playboy. Please consider subscribing to see more stories like this every single week. I wanted to say hi as well before we start, so yeah, hey. Oh, and if you want to grab a bag of my coffee classified, we're doing a huge sale for the next few days only. All you have to do is go to classifiedcoffeeco.com, select the bag that you want, subscribe, and then use the code NERO2025 at checkout. Anyway folks, please grab yourself a coffee and sit back and relax. This is the case of Kelsey Turner. Welcome back to California, folks, a place that all of us are familiar with. Now, although our case today will end up in Las Vegas, we're starting in the lesser-known city of Salinas, which is found south of San Francisco and along the coastline. With its close proximity to the ocean, this mild and temperate city benefits from cool coastal winds and a slow pace of life. But rather surprisingly, the city of Salinas bears a higher crime and homicide rate when compared to almost all other Californian cities. Many people seem to blame gang activity, but I'm wondering, maybe it's got something to do with the heat. It is worth noting here that violent crime rate has declined by 75% since 2015, so maybe the council is doing something right. Gang crime had long been the usual suspect in this city of 163,000 residents. Murders were rarely shocking here, and just another tragic footnote in the ongoing struggle between warring factions. But whenever a well-liked and innocent person was murdered, that would often become talk of the town. So, when in March of 2019 that the word spread that one of their own had been found dead 450 miles away, it was bound to capture people's attention. It all began on the morning of March the 7th, when Las Vegas police received a phone call from a worried citizen who happened to come across a rather concerning scene. The caller, who was a lone driver passing through the Lake Mead National Recreational Area, which can be found 30 kilometers east of the city, spotted something unsettling. It was off a dusty stretch of State Route 147 that an abandoned car sat eerily still in the morning light. The vehicle, which was later identified to be a blue Mercedes-Benz C300, was not the kind of vehicle one would expect to be randomly discarded in the middle of nowhere. Something felt strangely off about this, and so, after hesitating to make the phone call, instinct finally told him that something wasn't right and he should call the emergency services. Responding officers arrived at the remote scene unsure of what they might find, but as described, they would discover a Mercedes that sat haphazardly along the roadside, its glossy surface dulled by a layer of dust which had probably settled in the recent days. One of its windows had been shattered, and a rock which lay nearby was an ominous potential clue. Approaching with caution, the officers peered inside. The seats were empty, and little was left behind. However, as their search continued, a feeling of unease settled over them. The air suddenly seemed to be thick and oppressive, and then it hit them. It was the unmistakable scent of death. A foul odor, which was seeping from the trunk, left very little doubt about what they would uncover. And so, with a deep breath, they decided to lift the lid, and that is when their suspicions were sadly confirmed. Inside lay the body of an older man, likely in his 60s or 70s, and partially wrapped in bedsheets. Even from the outset, there was no question. He had long been dead. Beside his body, officers discovered blood-stained bath towels, latex gloves, a set of house keys, and what appeared to be his clothing. Further examination of the crime scene would reveal that this man had likely died from blunt force trauma to the head. In addition to this, he had defensive wounds over his hands and his arms, suggesting there was likely some kind of struggle. It was also determined that he was already dead before being placed in the trunk, and at least at some point along the way, he was also in the back seat. Now, this was undoubtedly a homicide, but the crime scene itself left far more questions than answers. I mean, they knew how he died, but why was he here? Who was he? What were the reasonings behind his murder? And who were the culprits? Well, mysterious details aside, it wouldn't take long for officers to learn the answers to two of these questions, and then, in time, the rest would follow. The first step for investigators was identifying who this man in the trunk was. Naturally, they started with the most traceable piece of evidence, that being the blue Mercedes-Benz. Running the license plates through their system, they found that the car was registered to someone only known as Kwong. However, after diving into this profile, they realized that his contact information was available. And so, after reaching out to him, it was revealed that the vehicle had been subleased to a woman named Kelsey Turner, someone who had seemed to be in possession of this vehicle since November the year prior. However, there was one more intriguing detail. The car payments were not made by Kwong or by Kelsey. Instead, they seemed to be coming directly from a man named Dr. Thomas Burchard, a resident of Salinas, California, which was hundreds of miles away from Las Vegas. To make things even stranger, after running Thomas's name through their own records, they quickly found a missing persons report in an ongoing case. And that's because only a few days prior, he had been reported as missing by his long-term partner, Judy Earp. It was Judy herself who would soon confirm their worst suspicions, because after being shown the recovered body, she responded with horror and devastation. All that was left of Thomas, her beloved partner of 17 years, was this messed up body. He had been violently murdered and then left in the desert, and she had a very horrible suspicion as to why.
A California physician is found dead in Las Vegas in the trunk of a car. Dr. Thomas Kirk Burchard was found on State Route 147 near the Lake Mead recreational area back on March 7th. The 71-year-old from Salinas died from blunt force injuries to his head. 8 News Now reporter Sally Jaramillo joins us live. And Sally, you spoke with Burchard's girlfriend, and she became concerned when he didn't come home. What did she have to say?
Yes, I spoke to Judy Earp, a lifelong girlfriend to Dr. Burchard. She tells me he loved to visit Las Vegas. He came here for multiple conferences, only this time he never made it back home.
It's been horrible. I mean, absolutely horrible.
On March 7, police found Dr. Thomas Kirk Burchard in the trunk of an abandoned car on State Route 147 near Lake Mead. Dr. Burchard's girlfriend Judy Earp says he came to Las Vegas on Friday, March 1st and was supposed to return home on March 4th.
My last communications with him was that he had looked forward to coming home on Monday.
After trying to reach him, she found it strange that his phone was turned off.
Monday I went to the airport and he didn't return home. He wasn't on the plane at all, and then I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just a lost phone or missed flight.
She checked with his secretary and heard nothing. Then she filed a missing persons report. Earp says his death is a shock to all who knew him.
It's been devastating for the community, the entire community. He was so devoted to his patients. He was 71 years old and he didn't want to retire.
Dr. Burchard is described as a generous person with both his time and money.
We've been together for 17 years. He helped me raise my 4 children, who are now all adults. He was just, really devoted, family man.
Earp hopes whoever did this will be caught soon and brought to justice.
I just think that whoever did this has to be soulless. I mean, can't even be a human being.
Dr. Burchard worked with Montage Health. In a statement, Community Health of the Monterey Peninsula spokeswoman Mary Baker said, quote, Dr. Burchard was a psychiatrist in our behavioral health program for almost 40 years and was very helpful to many patients. It's a very sad situation and our hearts go out to his family, friends, patients, and colleagues. We are notifying his patients and providing grief counseling for staff. Reporting live, Sally Jaramillo, 8 News Now.
At the time of his death, Dr. Thomas Burchard was 71 years old. It was in 2002 that Thomas moved to Salinas with Judy. They met and fell in love with each other only 1 year after his previous divorce. A divorce, as it would soon turn out, will become relevant later in this story. Now, Thomas was more than just a name in his community. As a child psychologist, he had a very easygoing nature and a gift for putting others at ease. His patients really did seem to adore him. He would entertain them with magic tricks and jokes, and would bring comfort to families navigating through difficult times. It's no surprise to learn that his caring demeanor and his dedication to his field made him a very well-respected doctor. Not only that, but he truly loved his work, almost as much as his patients appreciated him. After 4 decades at the community hospital of the Monterey Peninsula, retirement seemed to loom on the horizon for him. But you see, Thomas was not the type to simply walk away, and so he instead transitioned to a 4-day work week so that he could ensure his patients could continue receiving the treatment they needed for as long as they wanted him. With more free time, he could finally enjoy life outside of work, not only spending more time with Judy, but indulging in frequent trips to Las Vegas and other places across the country. Between the two of them, they would sometimes attend medical conferences, but other times, they would simply enjoy what the city had to offer. It was on Friday, the 1st of March 2019, that Thomas Burchard booked another flight to Las Vegas, but this time he would be traveling alone. Now, the reason for visiting this time had nothing to do with Judy, and instead, he was planning to meet up with another woman. But before we go jumping to any conclusions, there is one important thing to note here, and that is that Judy was fully aware of this woman's existence. As it turns out, their relationship was far more complicated than it seemed. We'll dive into that in just a moment. With this being a short weekend trip, Thomas was scheduled to return home the following Monday on March the 4th. And by the way, this trip was not sexually or romantically charged and was strictly formalities. Nothing unusual, or so he and Judy thought. But by the time March the 3rd rolled around and Tom was nowhere to be found at the airport's arrival gates, well, Judy, she seriously began to worry. Judy already found it quite strange that he hadn't messaged her the day prior, but for Tom to not message or call her on the day of his return, well, that was extremely out of character. However, there were several less than obvious reasons why this could have happened. You see, Judy believed that Tom was likely in the early stages of dementia, and so this could easily explain why he had seldom been in contact with her in the days prior. You see, it is worth noting here that apparently Tom had messaged her the day prior, but in Judy's words, it didn't sound like him whatsoever. And apparently, his vocabulary was quite thug-like. And with many of these recent messages sounding rather uneducated, which definitely wasn't like Thomas at all, she believed that maybe someone was trying to pretend to be him. In response to this disappearance, Judy decided to call Las Vegas police and request a wellness check, not only for Thomas himself, but also the woman he'd arranged to meet. And that woman's name was Kelsey Turner, a name which you may recognize as the person that blue Mercedes was leased to. At least to the investigators, this case seemed to be solving itself. The pieces of the puzzle were there now. It was just a matter of putting them all together. Anyway, the next step did seem quite obvious, and that was uncovering the connection between Thomas Burchard and a woman named Kelsey Turner. Quite eager to assist in finding out what had happened to him, Judy was fully cooperative with all leading investigators. It was through these efforts that she revealed everything she knew about his relationship with Kelsey, at least from her perspective. And so, with that said, let's dive into the disappointing world of Kelsey Turner. When detectives looked into her profile, they realized that Kelsey was a 25-year-old single mother who was living in Las Vegas. Born on May 5th, 1993, to her parents Samantha and Christopher Ingram, she made the move from Norfolk, Virginia to Jonesboro, Arkansas in her childhood. It was there she remained throughout her college years, where she studied at Arkansas State University, where she was known to be quite the hothead, but also nothing special. I'd like to emphasize that, primarily because despite her overinflated ego, she really was nothing special. During her studies, and like many other young women of her generation, Kelsey started to build a social media presence. But as it turns out, her true passion was not actually in academics, but in modeling instead. And so, after graduating, she made the decision to move to Salinas, California in pursuit of a career as a pin-up model. And in time, that pursuit surprisingly paid off, or at least marginally for a while. With striking features like golden blonde hair and seemingly flawless skin, Kelsey fit the mold of what modeling agencies looked for. As a result, she landed a string of small gigs, primarily for local adult magazines. You can still find her on Instagram, by the way, where her pictures show off the exact kind of person she really is. Branding herself as the Bad Barbie, you can find many risky photos of her lying on beds, taking drugs, and even showing off her buns. Through her online career, she had amassed more than 115,000 followers. And it does seem that throughout these efforts, she even managed to grab a few sponsorships too. However, as her ambition grew, she began to feel too small for her aspirations. And so, what would her next destination be? Well, it was Las Vegas, of course. While there, Kelsey's career began to build traction, and she steadily built a name for herself, where she would even secure high-profile modeling jobs in brands like 110 and Maxim. However, her most notable feature came in the year 2017, when she would grace the pages of Playboy Italia. With this newfound exposure, Kelsey's online presence would naturally skyrocket. By 2019, her Instagram had amassed over 100,000 followers, many of which who eagerly watched her as she immersed herself in the Las Vegas nightlife, which included her walking on red carpets and even giving glimpses into her glamorous, if not provocative, work. But while Kelsey had no shortage of admirers, her personal life was unfortunately far from picture perfect. She did have her fair share of short-term partners, but of course, looks are not everything, and unfortunately, the men that she attracted would often turn out to be rather problematic. Take her partner Greg, for example. Kelsey and Greg had dated each other after she moved to Las Vegas, and although they would have a son together, the relationship would not last. It wasn't hard to see why, because in January of 2019, Greg was arrested on charges of strangulation and domestic battery. We can only imagine the type of relationship they had before that ended. But of course, once it did, Kelsey was finally free to raise her son all on her own. After splitting up from Greg, Kelsey then rented a house in Las Vegas where she lived with her mother and her young son. However, as the year 2019 progressed, she found herself spending less and less time in that house. Instead, she rented a separate apartment with 2 other roommates, that being her new boyfriend John Logan Kennison and a close friend named Diana Pina. And by the way, it is worth noting here that both John and Diana would soon play key roles in this unfolding story. Despite the success that Kelsey once enjoyed, her modeling career slowly began to stall. And although she had landed that gig with Playboy Italia, it did not lead to any sort of financial stability. No surprise, but it was soon after this that she began to struggle to pay her bills, financially support her son, or maintain that luxurious lifestyle she had grown used to. So, what's a bright and well-rounded person supposed to do in a situation like this? Maybe buckle up, find a reliable job, and think about long-term development? Well, yes, but we're talking about Kelsey Turner here, so this wasn't going to happen. And unfortunately, that is where our dear friend Dr. Thomas Burchard entered the picture. Now, according to Judy, who was fully aware of their communication, Tom had met Kelsey online. They then began to exchange messages, forming a connection that, from the outside, seemed transactional in nature. While no one could say for certain what their relationship truly entailed, all signs pointed towards Thomas being Kelsey's so-called sugar daddy, an older man providing financial support to a younger woman in exchange for companionship. And although sugar daddies do often look for something more than just conversations, it honestly doesn't look like Thomas ever stepped over that boundary. He seemed to be more like a therapist instead. In their emails, Kelsey would often confide in Tom, telling him about how much she was struggling as a young mother without much money. It is quite evident that she would paint a picture of desperation, one that seemingly played on Thomas's generous nature and would often manipulate him into providing financial support. And despite any opinions on the dynamic between the two of them, there was one thing that was very clear here. Thomas, with his ever-compassionate heart, really did want to help. It is worth highlighting here how charitable Thomas was in other areas of his life too. I mean, the poor guy would literally perform magic tricks where he would turn a dollar bill into $100 bills and then let the person keep it. According to Judy, he was always trying to help people and would listen to anyone with a sad story. And of course, because of that, there were some people who would take advantage of him. So, do you remember the home that she rented for herself, her son, and her mother? And how about the other apartment that she rented with her 2 roommates? Well, as it turns out, both of them were actually financed by Thomas. The $3,200 per month for the house was paid directly out of his bank account, and records show that he had paid for this for at least a year. Tallying it up, that is more than $38,000, and unfortunately, that is not all of it either. As you can imagine, after 17 years together, Judy had a pretty good insight into Tom's finances. It was well known that Tom was very financially well off, but when she told the authorities that he had spent over $300,000 on Kelsey over the years, well, they were gobsmacked. It turns out that Tom had actually been doing this with other women too, and throughout multiple decades. He would meet many beautiful young women online, make them his sugar babies, and then shower them with money and gifts in exchange for their attention, which, quite understandably, would be the downfall of his marriage and divorce in the year 2001. Fully aware of his arrangement with Kelsey, Judy chose to view it through a more charitable lens. I mean, to be honest, this was not the first time that Tom had decided to help someone who is in need. However, the big difference is that, unlike the others, Kelsey was a master manipulator, and she had learned to exploit his empathy and his kindness for her own benefit. There was always a crisis with her, bills that needed paying, the looming threat of eviction, or even medicine that her son apparently couldn't go without. Tom's and Kelsey's relationship was complicated and unconventional to say the least. What began as a simple financial agreement had, over time, evolved into something far more tangled, with Tom becoming increasingly emotionally invested, and Kelsey becoming increasingly dependent. But let's highlight the most important woman in his life here, and of course I'm talking about Judy, and she had had enough. In light of all of this bullshit that was going on, she desperately urged Tom to cut Kelsey off. With his generosity going too far and Kelsey taking advantage of him, his finances were almost entirely drained at this point, leaving very little for him, his own retirement, or even his actual partner, Judy. Now, Tom resisted at first, claiming that Kelsey had recently told him that she was being abused by her current boyfriend. She told him that she had no money to escape and nowhere to go. And whether it was guilt, concern, or a mixture of both, Tom felt responsible for her well-being, but eventually he agreed that it was probably time to end their arrangement. However, before cutting ties completely, he wanted to see the situation for himself, to know for sure that Kelsey was not as desperate as she claimed. And so, as we know, he then booked a flight for March the 1st and intended to meet Kelsey in person to deliver the bad news. Sadly, that would end in a dramatic tragedy. The following day, after arriving in Las Vegas, Tom called Judy absolutely furious. What he found was not at all what Kelsey had described. She wasn't struggling, she wasn't desperate, and she wasn't even living full-time with her mother and son. And as far as he could tell, there were no signs of abuse either. He had been lied to, and of course that made him extremely upset. The last message that he had sent back home to Judy was, I had to check things out for myself. Kelsey is a consummate liar. And, well, the next thing that Judy knew is that Thomas had missed his return flight after telling Kelsey that he was going to cut her off. And as we know, that is when she called the authorities and asked for a wellness check. Police officers arrived at Kelsey's home on March the 5th, which evidently would be 2 days before Tom's body was found. However, without a warrant, the police were not able to enter the property. And guess what? But nobody was home. They did, however, peer through the windows, and they recognized that the home was basically empty and haphazardly cleaned. By the way, it was also noted that the back windows were left wide open and the front door was unlocked. However, no warrant means no warrant. Personally, I would have just gone in and taken a look. Now, according to the landlord, Thomas had already paid rent up front from December 2018 right the way through to June 2019, meaning there was still 3 months left on the property. So yeah, it was quite strange when officers arrived to see the property empty but way ahead of schedule. Of course, none of this made any sense to anyone. That was until Thomas's body was found. With Tom's body now discovered, officers had probable cause to enter the residence. A sweep of the property confirmed that no one was home at the time, neither Kelsey, her family, nor her boyfriend John. However, a more comprehensive search revealed many signs of a violent confrontation. For example, one of the interior doors had been broken in half, and there were bloodstains marked all over the walls and floors. Furthermore, forensic analysis identified fingerprints belonging to Kelsey, John, and Diana, and scattered throughout the home were cleaning supplies, which clearly provided evidence of a hasty but incomplete attempt to erase the traces of what had happened. Meanwhile, in the bathroom, investigators found bath towels which were identical to those recovered from Tom's body, and among the personal belongings left behind, they uncovered a notebook belonging to the doctor himself. Inside the notebook was a chilling insight into the power dynamic between Tom and Kelsey. According to his writings, Kelsey had at times tried to blackmail him, threatening him that if he didn't pay her money on a regular basis, then she would spread false accusations about him owning illegal material involving minors to his friends, family, and workplace. To be clear here, an extensive forensic investigation found no evidence to support Kelsey's claims, and her accusations are, at least to the best of their knowledge, entirely fabricated. But for a well-respected child psychologist to have even the mere suggestion of such allegations, well, that would have been absolutely devastating. And so, with these grim discoveries, there was one question on everybody's mind. Where had Kelsey disappeared to? Neighbors reported seeing Kelsey, John, and Diana leaving the property on March the 6th. However, nobody had spotted them since then, which did further suggest that they had deliberately fled the crime scene. It was at that moment that investigators turned to Kelsey's second apartment in hopes for a clue, but as expected, it was also abandoned, offering no indication of to where they may have gone. Detectives' best chance at tracking the fugitives was via phone records, which the authorities thankfully gained access to on March the 12th. Cell phone data revealed that Tom's phone had gone silent on March the 3rd, while Kelsey, John, and Diana's phones had all left the property together on March the 6th, this further suggesting that Tom had likely been killed sometime between those dates. In the days that followed, police officers launched a manhunt for Kelsey, John, and Diana, but despite their best efforts, the trio had vanished. And when I say vanished, I quite literally mean vanished, because there were no signs of them anywhere. The police, they had no idea where to look or how to find them. But surprisingly, the next breakthrough in this case came from a rather unexpected source. Because only a few days later, it would be Diana herself that walked right into a police station. Now, you might be wondering why she decided to do this. Was it perhaps a tactical decision? And, well, the answer is yes. Now, obviously, she had come in to admit that yes, she was part of Thomas's murder, but she would also try to cooperate with the officers in return for leniency. And so, with that said, the whole story to Thomas Burchard's final trip to Sin City slowly began to unfold. It was on March the 2nd that Diana first met Tom. She had just finished her bartending shift and had asked Kelsey for a ride home. However, when the blue Mercedes pulled up, she realized that it was not Kelsey behind the wheel, but the doctor instead. With Thomas being unfamiliar with the city, he then handed his phone to Kelsey Kelsey and asked her to pull up Google Maps. However, instead of helping him with directions, she had other plans instead. It was in that moment that she violated his privacy by scrolling through his text messages. And that is when she made an unexpected discovery. There were messages between Tom and her mother. Now, before jumping to conclusions, these messages were not volatile in the slightest. The only reason Thomas had messaged Kelsey's mother is because he was actually concerned about her lifestyle. Not only was he worried about the drinking and the drugs, but also her son's well-being. But with Kelsey being Kelsey, rather than appreciating his concern, she erupted in fury instead. Thomas insisted that he was acting out of care, but also could not ignore the role that both drugs and alcohol had played in her life. Meanwhile, Diana sat and watched in the back seat as the argument escalated. He didn't understand why Kelsey was becoming so angry over these facts, as he was only trying to help. He further said that he loved her, but not the drugs. But rather than facing her own shortcomings, she became even more enraged instead, screaming at him and accusing him of betrayal, before eventually beginning to hit and slap him. Once they arrived at the house, Kelsey's boyfriend, John, worsened the situation. Now, remember, but Kelsey had previously told Thomas that John was being abusive towards her, a claim that was never actually proven. However, on the other side, there was one thing that was clear here. Neither Kelsey nor John was happy about their free lifestyle suddenly coming to an end. In a panic, Tom retreated to the guest bedroom, but Kelsey, who was clearly still fuming, turned to John instead and ordered him to, quote, knock Thomas out. John stormed into the bedroom and attacked Thomas with a baseball bat. Meanwhile, Diana, who was horrified, managed to pull John away from him, who had now seen the old man tragically collapse to the floor. She begged them to take him to the hospital, and so, to calm her down, John and Kelsey agreed to load Thomas into the back of the Mercedes, where they then promised to find a doctor. It was in this moment that Tom weakly turned to Diana and said, "You know they're going to kill me, don't you?" In response, Kelsey and John told Diana to go upstairs and clean up the mess in the bedroom. And as she walked away, she overheard Kelsey telling John to, quote, finish the job. After hearing a loud noise, Diana rushed downstairs, only to see John with a gun in his hand. The weapon was already covered in blood, as was John. Kelsey then looked at Diana and coldly said, "He's dead." Although no shots were fired, Thomas had essentially been pistol-whipped to death. In light of the news, Diana quite understandably went numb. Without thinking, she then walked into the kitchen and began to wash the dishes, her mind currently unable to process what had just happened. Meanwhile, John stuffed Thomas's body into the trunk of the Mercedes, before then taking off and abandoning the car and the body in the desert. Back at home, Kelsey and Diana scrubbed away any evidence of the crime scene, and then, when John returned, the three of them fled the area. However, this guilt would slowly gnaw away at Diana, and although she initially did escape with the couple, she eventually convinced them to let her go, and as soon as she was set free, she then handed herself in to the authorities. With the whole story now known by the police, the manhunt for Kelsey and John intensified. The two did a very good job at maintaining radio silence for well over a week, but on March 21st, 2019, and following a tip-off from police officers in Stockton, Kelsey Turner was finally arrested and then taken back to Las Vegas, where she was then thrown into a cell and would have to await trial.
Playboy model has been arrested in the case of a California psychiatrist who was murdered in Las Vegas earlier this month. Police arrested 25-year-old Kelsey Turner for the death of Dr. Thomas Burchard. His body found March 7th in a car near the entrance of Lake Mead National Recreation Center. The coroner revealed that Burchard had been bludgeoned to death.
It's been devastating. It really it has. It's the worst nightmare ever. I hope nobody ever has to go through this. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
Turner faces one count of murder. She reportedly worked as a model and appeared in Playboy and Maxim magazine.
John was eventually found too, and with all three now in custody, the prosecutors could finally build their case against them. And although the story did seem to be rather obvious, it is quite funny to learn that all three of them denied any involvement whatsoever. However, moving into the legal proceedings of this case, this was all due to change. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic and other things created many delays. And I say other things because it turns out that Kelsey would then go on to give birth during her stay in jail. However, after 3 years of delays, Tom's family and his loved ones would finally find justice. First to be sentenced was their roommate Diana, who, as we know, turned herself in and cooperated with the police. She pleaded not guilty to murder and instead guilty to being an accessory to murder. Ultimately, she was shown mercy by the judge and given a sentence of 3 years probation for her involvement. Next up, it was John's turn, who pleaded guilty to second-degree murder with a deadly weapon, along with conspiracy to commit murder. He was therefore sentenced to 18 to 45 years for his role in this horrible story.
I mean, I think from what we have here, everyone can agree this is an utterly toxic love triangle that just ended as brutally and as terribly as one can imagine. Just the sheer length of time and the pain that Dr. Burchard must have gone through is unimaginable. And Mr. Kennison, you did that. And you took this man away from people who obviously loved him and patients who very much needed him. And so I know you're aware that you're taking, harsh penalty for this because what you did is inexcusable. In accordance with the laws of the state of Nevada, you're hereby judged guilty of count 1, conspiracy to commit murder, and count 2, murder with use of a deadly weapon. On count 1, you're sentenced to 24 to 60 months Nevada Department of Corrections. That is to run consecutive to count 2. On the second-degree murder, you're sentenced to 10 to 25 years from the Nevada Department of Corrections. The total sentence, the aggregate sentence, will be 18 to 45 years from the Nevada Department of Corrections.
And finally, Kelsey's turn. In typical non-accountable fashion, Kelsey agreed to an Alford guilty plea, which basically allowed her to plead not guilty, but acknowledged that the state had enough evidence to prove that she was.
Ms. Kennison, how do you plead to those 2 charges?
She signed the plea in November of that year before finally being sentenced 2 months later. And so, on January the 10th, 2023, she ultimately received 10 to 25 years behind bars. While receiving her sentencing, Kelsey was visibly tearful. However, it is noted that this was not for the crime she had committed or the pain that she had caused, but very likely because she was caught instead. I think the chief attorney summarized her attitude quite perfectly by saying, she was content to leave someone she knew for a number of years and who supported her and her child financially for a number of years to rot in the back of the car that he paid for in the desert. And this highlights how selfish and callous this woman really is. Personally, I think she deserved so much more time behind bars. This horrible person, who was fueled by drugs, partying, and her own ego, preyed not only on Thomas and his money, but his good demeanor too. She didn't care about him or his well-being. All that she wanted was the dollar bills that he had spent so many years working on. Not only that, but she couldn't even do her own dirty work, ordering John to murder Thomas, who would then receive a harsher sentence than she did. She is the sole reason why others are behind bars, why loved ones are grieving, and why a kind-hearted man is now dead. So yeah, I mean, at least personally speaking, why isn't she serving the longest sentence for this crime? Tom's partner Judy had to watch all the initial court hearings, where Kelsey was seen smiling and laughing throughout. Even if she wasn't guilty of this crime, somebody she knew had just been murdered, and here she was parading as if it was just another photo shoot. Once again, I believe this just goes to show what kind of monster Kelsey Turner really is. No matter what Thomas Burchard's motivations were for trying to help a single mum in need, it is absolutely terrible that someone who had helped so many people in his life ended up paying such a devastating price for it. To this day, Thomas is missed by many in his community, from his family to his friends and even his patients, many of which he ensured were always getting the help they needed, even if it came at his own expense. He is remembered as a kind man who was always willing to help those in need. Judy still misses Tom to this day and often imagines him walking through the front door, even if deep down she knows this will never happen. And so, on that note, I think I'll end this video here today, folks, which is a wild story about an overgenerous man and a total scumbag. Now, I do still think that Tom should have been more careful and exercise his boundaries a little bit better, but at the same time, he did seem to be a lonely old man who was now suffering from dementia. It's one of those stories with a little bit of grey area, and so on that note, I'd love to know what you think about this one. What do you think about Tom's behaviour and actions? And what do you think about Kelsey's? As always, folks, please share your thoughts and opinions in the comments section down below. Once again, if you want to get a good discount for good coffee, go to classifiedcoffeeco.com, subscribe, and then use the code NERO2025. And finally, if you want to support the channel, go to my Patreon here, or alternatively, go to my social media here, most notably my Instagram. With that said, folks, thank you so much for watching today. As always, I really appreciate you making it to the end. I'll see you again in likely a few days, I'd say 3 or 4. But until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and as always, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.